Hello, hello, hello. Welcome back to Jen's Books. I hope that you're well and having a good week. This is my first reading catch up for July. I've pitifully only got 5 books that I've read so far this month, but I'm hoping that by the end of the month, when I do my sort of second catch up, that I'll have a lot more to share with you. But saying that, although they are small books, they are mighty, and there's a real mix as well. I've read a book from the 19th century, I've read a brand new thriller, I've read a collection of short stories and some poetry, so hopefully something for everybody. But let's get dug in. So the first book I read so far in July is Camilla by Sheridan Fanu, and look at that cover. If you've recently watched my last haul video, you'll see that I'm slightly in love with the cover of this book of Carmella. This is actually a novella that was published in 1871 to 1872. It was published in a magazine called the Dark Blue magazine. So it was published over a series of editions, and I think that kind of comes across in the structure of the story and the way that every chapter has sort of like a hook to make you want to keep reading onto the next chapter. But it's really interesting that, well, the thing that's interesting about Carmilla is it was published before Bram Stoker's Dracula. And there's an idea that perhaps this was involved in influencing Bram Stoker in his writing of Dracula. One thing is for sure, it's really difficult to read this without having Dracula and all of the sort of mythology about vampires already in the background. It'd be really interesting to read this without having read Dracula and without having watched any of the films or knowing anything about it, which unfortunately I do know quite a bit about it. So that made it quite difficult to separate. You know what's coming, you know, if you're familiar with Bram Stoker's Dracula or any of the other sort of books that those have influenced in the past. But what I would say is for such a sort of older book, 19th century book, it's really easy to access. It did grab me straight from the beginning, and it's a quick read. It's definitely one that I wanted to complete. I wanted to see through. And basically, the story is about an only child called Laura. She lost her mother and she lives with her father in a castle in Austria. Although they say she's sort of isolated and lonely, they do have money. They do live in a castle, and there are staff, and there's a governess, and there's a companion. So it isn't just Laura living by herself with the father in this castle. But it does have some of those sort of tropes that we come to be familiar with in later Gothic works. One day, Laura and her father are outside the castle when they see a coach crash, going at high speed outside where they live. And inside is a mother and her daughter. The daughter is kind of knocked semi-conscious, and the mother, she asks if they can look after her daughter for 3 months while she travels on to a important meeting that she has to get to. So they take this girl in, and that's when things start going a little bit odd. And initially, Laura recognises the girl as being a girl that she's dreamt about when she was a child, or she'd had this visitation when she was a child. Don't want to give too much away on this, but you can kind of see where it's going quite early doors because of that prior knowledge. But it's really interesting to read this, particularly as it was written by a woman. It predates Bram Stoker Dracula. And so I think in terms of the context itself, if you're interested in the history of Gothic fiction, this is one that you're going to enjoy. And I'm really enjoying it from a readability stance also. It's a quick read. It's dragging me through, and I really enjoyed reading it. It's certainly worth picking up, particularly if you can get it from the library or something like that, because it is a quick read. Secondly, I love all things Claire Keegan. I've not read all of her work. Claire Keegan is the author of the novels Foster and Small Things Like These, which was shortlisted for the Booker last year. And she's just an absolute genius at creating small books that are just absolutely stunning. Every line counts. She's just fabulous. I just really, really love her books. If you've not read Foster or Small Things Like These, I definitely recommend them, particularly Foster, which I've read this year. But this is her first collection of shorts. Well, no, I think it might be a second collection of short stories, actually. She She's written 2 collections of short stories. One is called Walk the Blue Fields, which I've not read yet, and this one is Antarctica. Obviously, those who, have watched my videos before will know that I'm drawn to books about cold places. And although, in many ways this is more metaphorical than, they're not based in the South Pole, there is a sense of coldness in the books, in the stories. And these stories, like her novels or novellas, they're very short and really pack a punch. There's no duds here. In terms of themes, there's a real sense of women losing control of their own stories. And one of the things that she does so well is include really rich detail that really draws you in. She takes you in right from the beginning with these just fabulous characters. You're drawn in. There's like an immediate hook. You want to know what's going on when these characters are going, what they're doing. She's like a genius of the showing over telling. But there's just, she seems to be able to pack so much in. It feels like a whole world in each story. And the first story is about a happily married woman who decides she wants to fulfill her curiosities of what it would be like to have an affair with a stranger. So she travels off into town to basically find a man for a hookup. And it's about her experiences, and as things kind of begin to unravel. And then there are sort of similar stories as well. There's another one where a woman meets a man in a cafe, and it's unclear sort of to begin with why they're meeting, and she thinks about her husband as well, and they go to a fairground, and there's just real sort of captures of, it feels like real life, but it's hyper realism, but also with this sort of this sense of the fantastical as well. If you've read any of Claire Keegan's work, you'll enjoy this. I can tell you that already. There are no duds there. There are no fillers. They're all thrillers. But she's just a fantastic writer. I can't help but wonder whether she's written poetry as well. I don't know. I couldn't found any sort of examples of collections that she's written, but the fact that every word counts, her prose is kind of sparse but also lyrical and rich. She's just fantastic. She doesn't hold the punches as well. So if you haven't read Claire Keegan before, pick up the short stories or the novellas, but definitely read her. She's fantastic. She's a really, really great writer. Another kind of cold theme is Sarah Moss's Cold Earth, which is another library book that I picked up. I've read books by Sarah Moss before. I've read Ghost Wall, which I really enjoyed. And this one goes back further. It's from 2009. But actually, there are quite a few similar themes to Ghost Wall if you've ever read that particular novel of hers. This book is about a group of archaeologists who travel to Greenland to do a dig on a very sort of isolated area to try and work out why the locals vanished in all those years before. And so there's a sense of this very sort of small group of strangers trying to rub along with each other. But as things go on, there's also sort of themes of the supernatural. There's themes about survival. And we start off looking through the eyes of Nina, who has left her sort of perfect and ideal life behind to sort of take part in this dig. She's actually friends with the guy who's running it, which is how she's got there, even though her specialisms aren't really aligned to what they're doing. She's kind of there on a favour from her friend, who we ever actually see through the eyes of. But they're doing this dig, and she starts having dreams of the past that are bleeding through, and her mental health starts to be affected. The difficulty I did have is that I found the character of Nina quite unlikable, quite prickly, and not someone that I immediately gelled with. But you don't stay with her through the whole book, and actually it didn't stop me reading it. But if you find unlikable characters quite challenging, you might find that with this particular book. But you do change the point of view as the book goes on, and you sort of see through the eyes of other characters and get to find out why they're behaving the way they are in the beginning. All the characters obviously have their own history and their own mystery and their own secrets, so those start coming through as well. And it's really interesting in a way that you see parts of the picture through the eyes of different people, but never the full picture. if that makes sense. So you're sort of piecing it together for yourself. But I really, really enjoyed this. In some ways, the end kind of spluttered out rather than having a big bang. But I wasn't mad at it. I didn't mind it, and I felt that it was probably quite appropriate for the story that that Sarah Moss is telling here. I wasn't mad at it at all, but it wasn't like a big bang at the end, you know, a big payoff. But it's a lot more subtle than that. But at the same time, there are these interesting themes, and in the background, alongside their experiences, they lose contact with the people at home. And what I found really interesting about this book is there's a virus that's broken out just before they've left to come to Greenland, and things are going south badly. You know, and they pick up on the news and things of this virus that's spreading, and then they lose contact completely, and there's this sense of what's happening beyond, you know, their situation and where they are. So there's so much going on there, and you know how I like an apocalyptic tale, but you do get like quite a neat ending. But yeah, I really enjoyed this. So if you've read Sarah Moss before and you've enjoyed her, I don't know if she has some sort of history in archaeology or ethnography, but there seems to be some sort of fascination with the past, and that really plays through in both of those novels. So yeah, I really enjoyed this. I liked the location, obviously, because it was Greenland, and yeah, really, really enjoyed it, much more than I thought I was going to, actually. So that's Cold Earth by Sarah Moss. But as I say, you know, I think having lived through COVID, there was something so unnerving about reading a book that was written 10 years before COVID hit, and it feeling so accurate and so real. So yeah, really, really good. The next book I read is a collection of poems called A Method, a Path by Rowan Evans, and this collection of poems has been shortlisted for the Forward Prize this year as one of the debut collections. So I picked up a few of these because I thought it'd be interesting to read, you know, and find out, you know, what's been selected for the prize. And actually, it's a really interesting. It kind of leads on quite nicely from Cold Earth. There's a real sense of deep history through these poems that Rowan's written. He's really experimental. If you like experimental poetry, you know, where there's a real playfulness with the form, and there's a use of lots of different forms, from prose poetry to poems with, you know, visual images and things. It's really interesting. It's quite a challenging collection in that way. And there's also, as I say, the sense of deep history and this drawing on Old English, both the language and sort of the myth and folklore that bleeds through into the poems. As I say, they're not necessarily an easy read. They're not necessarily a narrative read. It's a collection that I read quite quickly, but I feel like I need to spend some time with and sit with. There's a lot to think about here, and there are bits that I found quite difficult in terms of clarity, because obviously I don't know much about Old English, but I appreciated the sort of the effort and the experimentalism that went into the writing of the poetry here. And as I say, this sort of there's a sort of feeling of standing on shifting sand as you're reading the collection. You never quite know what's going to come next, or what's happening, but not in an unpleasant way. I found it really interesting, as I say, really experimental, and I don't mind being challenged occasionally with poetry, but I think it's a collection that's going to stay with me for a while. It's not a collection that I read and loved immediately, but there's so much to think about and consider here, that I really appreciate it from that point of view. And as I say, I don't think I've read anything quite like it. The sort of this experimentation and this use of translation, and Old English amongst the poems. So and as I say, really different you know, forms throughout. So if you don't read a lot of poetry, it may or may not be something that interests you. If you are into your poetry, it's probably worth picking up and having a little browse through. But yeah, a lot of work clearly went into this collection, and I applaud it for that. From that, we come to the final book that I've read so far in July, and that is Ruth Ware's 0 Days. And so we've got a good old-fashioned thriller here to end with. I've read every book by Ruth Ware. I read a lot of them. I binged a load of them during the pandemic, actually, when I felt like I wanted to read something that was a bit escapist and a bit reassuring, you know, things working out at the end. I particularly enjoyed The Lying Game. And I also really enjoyed One by One, because I think that was based, if I remember rightly, in like a ski resort that's all snowed in, which of course is a perfect location for me. So this novel has just come out. This is her book for 2023, and I'll be honest, it's not my favourite of her books, and I'll explain a little bit more in a moment. But in terms of page turning, tension, wanting to read on, yeah, ticks all the boxes, you know, as far as a thriller is concerned. And, you know, as I say, I've read everything by Ruth Ware, and I'm, you know, I'm a follower of her writing. So if she prints something, I'm going to pick it up and read it. But, you know, there are other books that she's read. Last year her book was The It Girl, and I also really enjoyed that as well. So you know, I think there's more hits than misses in her back collection if you enjoyed the thrillers. But this book is quite an interesting premise, quite an unusual premise, coming after the last couple of books that she'd published. And it's the story of a girl called Jack Cole, or a woman called Jack Cole, who works in a really odd industry, and we don't find out immediately what that is, and I'm sort of hesitant to tell you, but I'll tell you, and I think it says on the back. Basically, her and her husband are hired to try and break into businesses to test their security systems. So she does the physical side, and her husband Gabe does all the sort of technological hacking type stuff. So the novel begins with her breaking into a business, and we don't actually know that it's a job to begin with. So it, you know, there's this sort of sense of, is it espionage? Why are they breaking in? And we're getting a bit of a view of their relationship and their closeness and the way they work together. And it really grabbed me from the beginning. But when she gets home from that job, she finds her husband's been murdered, and that's kind of the premise of the whole novel. So it says that on the blurb, so I don't think I'm giving away too much. But it becomes a sort of cat and mouse chase story, as Jack becomes, you know, suspect number one, and she decides to use all of her expertise to work out what actually happened to Gabe and who's responsible for his death. So the only difficulty I think I found from this, because it's sort of forward linear action all the time, there's plenty of tension, but there's less breathing spaces than I would have quite liked. Then there's less of a sense of the characters, or particularly the periphery characters, because everything's through the eyes of Jack and Shiz by herself for a majority of the book. So I found that I didn't feel as invested, and I think probably the topic isn't so much to my taste as, you know, a snowed in ski resort, or, you know, a academic type of setting. So there's that as well. But if you know, that interests you, if you love a good thriller and you just want to read something that's going to keep you reading throughout, you know, you can't really beat Ruth Ware. I don't think. I mean, thrillers are actually something I came to later on in life, so possibly I've not read as broadly as some other readers. And I'm always up for really good recommendations, actually, of thriller writers. But yeah, I mean, I'm glad I read it. It wasn't my favourite of her books for the reasons that I've given, but still, you know, I read it and devoured it in about 2 days. So that in itself says quite a lot. But if you like thrillers, you might want to, you know, look at Ruth Ware and some of her back catalogue. But that's my reading so far for July. As I say, I'm hoping that there'll be a lot more to share with you later in the month, or the beginning of August. But I'd really like to know what your thoughts are. If you're new to the channel, do come along and subscribe and join us for the journey. But I'm always really interested to hear what people's thoughts are on the books that I'm talking about, and whether you've read any of them, or whether you've got recommendations based on those, or other books that you think are better. You know, let me know. It's really interesting to have that conversation. But in the meantime, have a fantastic rest of the month, and I will speak to you again soon. Take care. Bye.